And joining us now to talk more about all of this is a man with a lot of experience in the skies. Captain Mark Weiss flew several different types of passenger jets for American Airlines. He's contributed to several U.S. government airline security initiatives. He's with the Spectrum Group, which is based here in the Washington, D.C. area. It seems that there's more demand than there may actually be qualified pilots. Is that a fair assumption?
It's a very fair assumption, and it's fair in the United States as well as it is in the emerging countries in the world, including China and India. You're seeing more and more of a need for commercial airline pilots.
And the problem of inexperienced pilots isn't just in Asia, it's a global issue. We saw it here in the United States. People may remember the crash. Logan Air flight that was back in 2009 in Buffalo. And then just a year ago, we saw this crash in San Francisco. I think we have video we're going to show of this. This wasn't just an issue of maybe an inexperienced pilot, but it was also an issue of culture, isn't it? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, absolutely. What you've had over in that crash in San Francisco, which was a Boeing 777, with a captain who was transitioning from one jet airliner to the left seat, the pilot's captain seat, in the Boeing 777, and a check airman in the right seat who was checking that pilot out on the route and the aircraft. In the aircraft, you also had an experienced first officer. Part of the problem was nobody wanted to speak up. Culturally, it's very awkward, particularly in Asia and in Latin America, to speak up against authority. In the United States and in most Western countries, in fact, I think almost all Western countries, it's required by law that you speak up. If you're uncomfortable with a situation, if you see something wrong, if you see somebody responding inappropriately to something, the safety of the aircraft should be everyone's primary concern in the cockpit.
And if it's not, it can cost lives, as we saw, and that's one example there. You, having spent as much time up in the air as you have, how alarmed are you at the situation, the landscape, as you look out there, not just here in the United States, but globally?
Well, you know, I think in many ways it's frightening, in the sense that the way pilots are trained today, they don't have the skill sets that people say of my generation did when we grew up what we used to call needle ball and airspeed, where you really learned how to feel and fly the airplane. So much of today, so much of the pilots of today, and the training today is really just how do you fly the computer? What do you do when something goes wrong on the computer? You don't really understand the aircraft itself. And that has a lot to do, the fundamental reason that has a problem is because an airline is an economic machine. And the time you spend in training or the time you are allotted to get your pilot's license, it goes down over the years. It's less and less now than it was years ago.
But is it fair to say you're an instinct guy? I mean, you've been around it so much that it's instinctual, whereas if you're just doing it with a computer, it may not come to you automatically.
Well, you know, part of pilot training really is if something happens, stop, take a deep breath, and then you act and react appropriately. Part of the training has always been, over the years that I've gone through training, is it teaches you how to think. And that really is important, not just react. When you have to put the two together, you have to be very careful.
And time, you don't have a lot of time in many cases. Let me read to you. This is, comes from the president of the Air Pilots Association International. He wrote Lemock saying he is in support of allowing some pilots to qualify for airline service in less than the flight hours routinely required. He says that method will give the airline some flexibility in hiring pilots by accounting for the varying quality of training programs. What's your take on that?
I think it really depends on the airline and where you are. If you've got an airline that has a program that really allows you to learn and be mentored along the way, it's different than if you just put into a right seat, the co-pilot seat, with very little time. And there's a big difference between the amount of time that's required in some Western countries and what you're finding in Asian countries. Particularly here in the United States, where after the Colgan accident, the requirements for going into a commercial airliner, regional airliners, really drastically changed from just a few hundred hours to now like over 1,500 hours, depending on your education and depending on the level of experience you've gained through the years.
Mark Weiss, thanks so much for coming in and talking to us. Certainly appreciate it. It's a very important issue.